Hi, guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. I want to touch on what could be a pretty controversial question in some circles, probably not here, but I find it interesting. Were the Allies morally superior, morally better than the Axis powers? That might seem like a blasphemous question because modern history and the recording of modern history, particularly, is very heavily influenced, as we all know, by the winners and losers of the Second World War. We've been told that it was a war between good and evil, and even today, going back to the speeches of all the leaders involved from the various sides, we can see that there are indeed many common themes that are prevalent in both sides. Of course, it's easy to see why this image of the allies being good guys and the Axis powers being the bad guys, it's easy to see why it's stuck and why so many believe it so wholeheartedly. It's because the Nazis, the fascists, and the Japanese really did behave in an extremely savage way. The Holocaust, for instance, as I've said many times before, is quite easily the biggest organized attempt to exterminate a community in modern times. And in many ways, the calculated brutality of it was what was so shocking. If you look at savage brutality in previous eras of history, we will always find massacres and genocides and all that when we go through history. But they would usually be in the context of war and conquest. Genghis Khan and his Mongol successors, for example, did massacre and rape their way across half the world, but it was in the context of warfare and conquest. It wasn't some kind of bureaucratic structure where life carried on normally for everybody while your next door neighbors might disappear and be put in some camp where they're starved, experimented on, and killed simply because of their religion. I know I'm simplifying and downplaying historical violence, but I'm just trying to contrast it with the level of organization here. That there's certainly sort of savagery that's existed before, but there's also a certain type of savagery that came from them being civilized. The cruelty of the Holocaust did not come from a primal urge to destroy and conquer. It was a far more calculated and rationalized approach than that. The fascists and the Japanese were certainly not much better. Fascism is used as a pejorative for ruthless authoritarian rule even today. Of course, the word has now become a meaningless slur in modern politics since people call any politician they dislike a fascist. So, if you don't like Trump, call him a fascist. If you don't like Kamala Harris, call her a fascist as well. That's how the term seems to work now. But there's a good reason for the aberration which comes with that word, because the fascists were that bad. In fact, at least with the Nazis, you had the Nuremberg trials where many of the higher ups, some of the higher ups, not many, some of the higher ups were punished in some form. The fascists, on the other hand, never really got the same spotlight as the Nazis. In fact, many of the horrible war crimes they committed in places like Ethiopia, for instance, still largely go unpunished. And you can say the same for the crimes they committed in Libya, Yugoslavia, even Greece. There's a historian called James Walston who even points this out. He says the Italians never really had to face their demons the way that the Germans and the Japanese were forced to. He said the Italians never really had their Nuremberg. To this day, Germany and Japan are constantly reminded of their World War II legacy, and it still plays a big role in their politics. But there's no such thing in Italy. The Italian army used several hundred kilograms of mustard gas on Ethiopian villages, poisoning them wholesale. They ran concentration camps in Yugoslavia. One of their famous Generals Rudolfo Graziani, was even known as the butcher of Libya. And yet, they never really had their day of reckoning like the Germans and Japanese did. Speaking of the Japanese, there's very little that can be done to deny the cruelty of their crimes either. The way they tortured and killed thousands of prisoners was just horrifying. They used to conduct these things called death marches, where they would tie up tens of thousands of captured enemy soldiers and make them march. The Bataan Death March is said to have killed like 20,000 Filipino soldiers or something like that. The Sandakan march killed about 3,000 American soldiers. And this is not even counting their main atrocities, their scorched earth policy against China, the total sacking of Singapore and Malaysia, the Changjia massacre, the Manila massacre, of course, the rape of Nanking. All of these claimed tens of thousands of lives. And the number of people who were raped and tortured and assaulted is in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions. And now that we've clearly stated that the Axis powers did commit crimes as well, so now that it's clear we aren't just here to sort of defend the Axis powers and malign the Allies, we come to the original question of whether the Allies were morally superior. We all know about the nuclear strikes against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which essentially destroyed half of Japan. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Americans were carpet bombing Japan even before that, and they would intentionally target urban centers and drop napalm in the middle of Japanese cities. Something like 25% of Japan was homeless even before the nuclear strikes came into play. The firebombing of Tokyo, for instance, claimed the lives of over 100,000 people, and many of them were said to have just melted alive. People talk about the firebombing of Dresden, but the firebombing of Tokyo was even more destructive. On the side of the British Empire, I've covered the topic of famines before and how they engineered famines in India because they had to feed their own troops, and this resulted in the deaths of millions of Indians. So in terms of pure death toll, the British had a body count in the millions as well, not just the Nazis. And of course, one of the most important members of the Allied powers, Stalinist Russia, was also known for its own share of atrocities. In fact, as time went on, statistically speaking, more people died as a result of Stalin's policies than all the Axis powers combined, including Hitler. So what's the point of this question? Am I trying to say that the Allies were somehow morally inferior? No. Am I trying to defend or mitigate the crimes of the Nazis or the fascists? No. I just think it's an interesting question, and I hope some of you agree, in light of the context I've just given you, that we need to think about this. Whenever there's a war which ends in a winner and a loser, the winners rewrite history where they're the good guys and the vanquished enemies are the bad guys. All of us know that already. Everybody watching this already knew that. And yet, when it comes to applying that simple lesson to our understanding of history, many of us seem very reluctant to do it for some odd reason. If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.